Today we have two sessions ahead of us, and the first session should have been moderated by Dr. Yonghui Ma Yonghui. But I received a letter from her this morning saying that a private matter has turned up. She actually has to take her baby girl for vaccination, which I think is quite appropriate. Originally, her husband would do that, but now something urgent has turned up for him, so he will not be able to do that. And as a result, Yonghui cannot moderate this first session. So instead, Göran Kolste has graciously accepted to do so. And without further ado, I yield the floor to Göran, please.
Thank you very much. Yes, good morning, or good afternoon, or good night, or whatever. We will start our second day with a speech by Mauson. Then we have a little change in the program. So after, should I say Mauson, Lee Mauson, by the way?
Yeah.
Which is the best order?
Yeah, I will do it first, maybe.
Lee Mauson.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I will be then continuing. So after Lee Mauson's speech, I will give my speech. And then due to some misunderstanding here, we will hopefully get Surai Honglabaram's speech as the last one, but it's not definite yet. We'll see. Okay, so let's start, and we will have two speeches then, Lee Mauson's first and my own after that, and then we will have a little break, and then we come back with Torbjörn, who will then chair the rest of the day, and we also want to have a final discussion about some future plans also after the presentations. Okay. So Lee Mauson, whom I have known since about more than 20 years. He is working at the University of Helsinki since this year, I suppose. Yes, you work with the Confucian Institute there, don't you? But before that, he has been teaching courses in ethics at Renmin University in Beijing for about 25 years. His interest is in ethical theory, moral education, and Confucian moral philosophy. He's also interested in Chinese philology and translation. And he graciously invited me, something in 1997, 98 or something, to a conference on ICT ethics in Beijing. Yeah. Lee Mauson's speech is titled "The Initiative Principle in Confucianism and its Implication in China's Public Policy for the Pandemic and Climate Change." So, very welcome.
Yeah. Thank you, Göran. Thank you, Torbjörn. Yeah, everybody. Yes, I would like to share the screen first, share my document first. I think this is a very interesting topic. Because it's we all know about Confucianism, but what's the nature?
So you can make it full screen if you're not okay. You click down at the right there, you know, the full screen. Then we will see you. Do you see the full screen sign at the end or back at the down bottom on your to the right down? Yes, you can do it from other places. Yeah, thank you. Good.
Okay. Yeah, it's an honor for me to talk about Confucianism today, because Confucianism is very popular. It seems everybody know about it, but actually there are some ideas, I think, hidden behind it. So as the beginning, I checked the dictionaries. We can see that there are so many definitions of Confucianism from the dictionary because it says popular understanding of it. For example, they think Confucianism is a system of philosophical and ethical teachings founded by the Chinese philosopher Confucius. But here it's not incomplete, because Confucianism is not the ideas of Confucius, it's the ideas and practice heralded by Confucius. So another dictionary says, Confucianism is the ethical teachings formulated by Confucius and introduced to Chinese religion, emphasizing devotion to parents, family, and friends, cultivation of mind, self-control, and just social activity. And another dictionary is a bit more, there's a bit more complicated introduction of Confucianism, but it also shows some common ideas. For example, emphasize on the practice and cultivation of the cardinal virtues of filial piety, kindness, righteousness, propriety, and intelligence, faithfulness, that historically has formed the basis of much of Chinese ethics, education, statecraft, and religion. That is true. All these are true. But actually, if you look at the Chinese word for Confucianism, it does not show the word Confucius. Actually, it is, the word is this, is Ruism. I checked it on the Wikipedia. It says Confucianism, also known as Ruism. So what is Ru? What does the word Ru means? That is the problem. And here, I think I would like to just have to show you the description from here, an introduction to Confucianism. This book is edited by my colleague Xinzhong Yao 10 years ago. But here, I think he quoted a lot of ideas from the Chinese literature. And he thinks that the origins of Ru might, not sure, you say, might actually refer to the different periods in the evolution of the groups of the men who were called Ru. And the Ru went through a number of stages before the time of Confucius. That is true. But here comes the problem. Firstly, Ru referred to dancers and musicians in the religious rituals. Dancers and musicians, I think it's not so good translation or not so good interpretation, who are characterized by those softness and flexibility. That is the problem here, softness and flexibility. So my explanation today is about softness. What's the nature of softness? At this stage, Ru was a special group in society whose members were roughly equivalent to what we mean by shamans, magicians, or sorcerers. These apart, I think, not the whole picture of Confucianism. And then it concludes that thirdly, Ru were masters of rituals and ceremonies who performed or assisted the performance of various rituals. At this stage, Ru referred to professionals expert in religious rituals, rites, and ceremonies. So it concentrates on this word, rites, because that is another misinterpretation of the Chinese word li, rites, the book of rites. Thirdly, rituals masters became teachers in official education. To be able to look after rituals, Ru must have mastered history, poetry, music, astrology, archery, and mathematics. which were closely related to rituals in ancient times. I think this is not related to rituals. They should be closely related to life, the life of their time. So that is the explanation of Chinese word Ru, the nature of Confucianism. And then it also says Ru is said to come from the character Xu. Xu was composed of two parts, cloud, and cloud is rain, raining cloud and sky. So it means people, Confucius is the man who is in a shower, suggesting a ritual ablution, a bath before a Ru went about his responsibilities. I think this is kind of simile. The scholar keeps himself free from stain and continuous bath his virtue. This is kind of metaphor. And also the real meaning is that it means, this word actually means need. It means Confucianism is what people need. So this is not my explanation. We've been to another dictionary, which is compiled in 100 CE, 100 AD 100 in Han Dynasty. It's 500 years after Confucianism. So its explanation about Confucianism is Ru is typically defined as Zhou, this word. This word in Chinese, it means, nowadays Chinese, it means soft, but which has been translated into modern Chinese as usually as an adjective, meaning soft, weak, or elegant. So I think it's the modern Chinese, a modern scholar in China forget the real meaning, or the real meaning of this word is not soft. According to the ancient, I just said that ancient Chinese lexicon, Ru means soft, but my opinion is that the original meaning of Ru, such soft, is the bud of a plant, which is soft, but will grow stronger and straighter. So this word, you see, this is the original word meaning Ru. It is, you can see this is part is wood and plant, and this part is the bud, something sharp, something from beginning. So some Chinese dictionaries indeed see the first three meaning. For example, the first one is, it means the growth of the wood and plants, and the tender part of the plant is the beginning of life. And second meaning is the opposite of hard, soft and hard. But soft and hard in Chinese meaning is not simply as we understand it as yin yang or separately. It means it's together. It should be understood together. It means growth. And the third meaning, it means the physically, nowadays we understand, the physically hard. So I think that is in ancient China, the Chinese word has many meanings, but in modern China, we take the some of it, not the complete. So the Confucianism is understood now is not in the incomplete picture. From my understanding, the initiative, I think I use this word initial at the beginning, the initial principle in Confucian philosophy and practice is to help people live well in a well-organized society and grow into good people. But here's the problem, because how to live well? Who will live well? Who allows whom to live well? That is really problems, especially in different stages of our societies. And from my understanding, I think the Confucian ideology, 礼乐, is not simply rights and pleasure, or some people even translate this word into music. They think the Confucians are good at rights and music, so they thought they were dancers and musicians. That is completely wrong, I think. The real meaning is that the Confucian ideas is try to help people to live well. So this, you see, this plate is kind of architecture. It's just near the Forbidden City in Beijing. There are 4 words on it. These words are, it means big virtue, means life, or greatest virtue, support life. So life is really the greatest word, the big foundation of Confucianism. Although this plate is not set up by Confucians, it's rather it was set up by Taoism. But we think it's, they all support life, but in different ways. So Confucian theories and practices are big, complex in China and other Asian countries, both in history and in reality. Based on my understanding on such value orientations illustrated in my speech, it is possible to find out the deviation in the interpretation or development of Confucianism. But there is a big problem. The problem is that the moral rhetoric has changed in some way now. So when we talk about global ethics, when we talk about the basic principle in Confucianism, so what's its relation? How about its implication in China's public policy for the pandemic and the climate changes? This is the topic of my speech. So I think, although life, the emphasis of life in Confucianism is the initial principle. This understanding will help us to reach a certain kind of reflective equilibrium. When we meet with problems, then we go back to that idea. Then we think about it and make collectively agreeable decisions for moral or political dilemmas, such as the lockdown of a city versus some individual rights during the pandemic. I'm not sure if you know, if you are not. Last year, in June, June the 7th, last year, actually the Chinese government issued a white paper. It's called Fighting COVID-19, China in Action. Not many words, but there are 4 sections. The first one is China's fight against the epidemic. I don't know the use of the word a test of fire, but that is really very, very serious situation because we have different situations. In China, there are so many people. If people gathered and then the virus spread very quickly. The second part is well-coordinated prevention, control, and treatment. The third part is assembling a powerful force to beat the virus. The fourth part is building a global community of health for all. And I emphasize this part, the third part. The third part is assembling a powerful force to beat the virus. And there are also 4 small paragraphs. The first paragraph is lives are precious. But this translation is not so proper, I think. So I also cite the Chinese version here. According to the Chinese version, it says, life are the most valuable. Life are the most precious. Life are above all things, other things. That's the meaning. So I said the rhetoric changed. They don't see this is the idea of Confucianism. They don't see this is the moral ideology of traditional Chinese society. So further, they say praising people's lives above economic growth, saving lives at all costs, care and compassion for Chinese citizens overseas, a national tribute to the deceased. There are a lot of people died, so they have a national ceremony to like monument. So they think life is really the very beginning of all our actions, all our decisions and public policy. And then it says mobilizing the whole country to fight the epidemic, coordinating prevention and control with social and economic development, and uniting as one, China as billion people. We have 1.4 billion people. It's really a big population. So later, there is a kind of conclusion. They want to know what is the spirit of fighting the epidemic. There are 5 sentences. I repeat it. This is my translation, because other Chinese people or people who know Chinese may interpret in other ways. I think the first principle is life should be above all else. We all have common wishes. We work even at the cost of our own lives. We respect science and work accordingly. We have to safeguard our life and society. But it sounds very, very good. But if I tell you these words are from President Xi, and then suddenly you may think it's have another tunes, because you think this may be propaganda. But I think there's some truth in it. Yes. So I think I got some ideas about the Confucian ideas. The basic Confucian idea is life, supporting life. So it's even no matter for the pandemic or for climate change, that is a point for us to make decisions, especially about public policy. Thank you very much. That's my speech.
Thank you very much for this very interesting presentation of Confucianism and how it is related to the present policies of China policy when it comes to the pandemic. So I think perhaps we shall save the questions for our discussion after the second presentation. And as I told you before, there was a little switch here in the program. So I will now give my presentation, and then Surai Hongadarum will present make his presentation at the end of the this day's program. So, and then we said that perhaps if you can have your videos on, it's nice to see you when we talk. I think it's better we feel that we belong to a workshop together, if it's possible. And then I give the word now to Torbjörn, who will chair the rest of this session.
Thanks a lot, Göran, and most welcome to Sorai. We missed you. It's so nice to see that you have been able to join us. And also most welcome to Ma Yonghui, who also seems to be with us. That's also very nice. Now it is my pleasure to introduce my friend Göran Kolste, who is the co-organizer of this webinar, and as I said yesterday, who has really done the most important work when it comes to finding all participants in the webinar and identifying such eminent participants at that. Göran himself is a specialist in ethics. He is now a professor emeritus in applied ethics at Linköping University in Sweden. He has published books and articles on global justice, the principle of human dignity, research ethics, and ethical issues related to information and communication technologies. Professor Kolste was director of the Center for Applied Ethics at Linköping University and president also for a few years of Societas Ethica, the European Society for Research in Ethics. He held that office from 2011 to 2015. Presently, he is an expert member of the Swedish National Council on Medical Ethics. So you can see that he is quite an ideal person for taking part in this project. And now I will give the word to Göran, who will give a presentation on the topic, where you live should not determine whether you live. Where you live should not determine whether you live. Global justice and the distribution of vaccines. Please, Göran.
Thank you, Torbjörn. And perhaps I can also add to this at this moment that I have been to China several times, in fact. So I was the international academic advisor for the Institute of Technology in Harbin in northern China. We're teaching ethics in Harbin for 4 following years, not full years, of course, but some weeks each year. So I have, and even tried then to learn a little Chinese. Not very successful, but anyway, I made some efforts. But I will talk about another topic now, and I will share my screen with you. See if this works. Can you see it? Does it work? Okay, see that for Luis. And as we said, you can put on your videos if you want to, because I think it's nice also to see you when we have this discussion presentation. Okay, so I will start my presentation. My plan is to say something about global vaccine distribution during this last years here when we have been stuck or hit by the coronavirus. I would say something about ethical principles related to how we can look at this distribution. I will suggest a middle way, which I will explain later, and I will also come to the question, what are the practical implications of this middle way? But let me start from the summer 2020. In Washington Post in July 2020, world leaders, which means prime ministers and presidents from South Africa, from Canada, from South Korea, from I think Liberia, from Sweden and some other countries, presented an article with the headline, "The international community must guarantee equal global access to the COVID-19 vaccine." This was in many ways very kind of radical and gracious message in this article, and I noticed especially the following part, and I will quote: "Where you live should not determine whether you live." And global solidarity is central to saving lives and protecting the economy. Where you live should not determine whether you live. That's why I also have the title here for my speech on this. What does it mean? What does it imply? That's one of the questions I will deal with today. Of course, it's important that this declaration was made, because if you look at the statistics on healthcare resources, you see that the global gaps are wider here than perhaps in any other area. These are little arbitrary figures, but I just picked them from the World Bank statistics, saying that Armenia, kind of a middle economy country, gets can put $407 per person and year on healthcare. Bangladesh and Congo, two of the low-income countries, have $36 and $20, while Sweden's budget for healthcare is $5,900, and US, or even the double. So this shows little the resources different countries are able to put in healthcare when they are hit by a virus like the coronavirus and COVID-19. So the ambition that where you live should not decide whether you live would have great implications, of course, for distribution of vaccines. And we know that very quickly there was a production of vaccines. Pfizer, AstraZeneca were, I think, the first ones. Just less than a year after the pandemic started, they could offer vaccines. And the vaccines could have been distributed widely over the world. However, quite soon there were some signs saying that this was perhaps not what was going to happen. Because even if before these vaccines were on the market, the richest countries bought up the vaccine. The richest countries already bought 80% of Pfizer vaccine, was this article in November 2020. We know that the EU, the UK, the US purchased the vaccines even before they were produced. From the WHO director, World Health Organization Director General Tedros Ghebreyesus, there was a warning, constantly warning what was happening here. He said the world was on the brink of a catastrophic moral failure. And unfortunately, it seems that he has been right so far. Because if you see statistics from vaccine distribution, you can see that and this is taken from yesterday, these figures. You see, while the upper middle income countries have something like 70% vaccinated, this is just one dose of COVID-19. Most of these countries have already 2 doses. If you look at the low-income countries, about 1 billion persons living in the low-income countries in Africa and in Bangladesh, in Asia, sorry, they have only 5 or 6% vaccination rate when it comes to the population. Not even healthcare personnel has got vaccinated so far. Where you live should not decide whether you live. It seems that this is not come true, at least so far. We know there are different obstacles for this, of course. For the low-income countries, poor distributions, perhaps some skepticism against vaccines, but the main reason is the one that the WHO director points at. that the rich countries have hoarded vaccines, so that's enough for many vaccines per person, while the vaccines are lacking in the low-income countries. This is facts. When we discuss ethics, we have to have facts as a basis, but we also have to discuss which ethical principles, of course, that should and ought to govern and direct the distribution of vaccines or distributions of any kind of goods. As I said, I'm a member of the Swedish National Council of Medical Ethics, and when we wrote a report already published in May 2020, we discussed here in the report, wrote about the global distribution, and we formulated two, in this report, ethical choices in a pandemic. We formulated two principles: global justice and international solidarity. This was not only principles for our council, even for example, the British Nuffield Council and the Hastings Center in the US and other centers have pointed at this, and we can also see from Mauson's presentation about the Chinese idea about the global health as a goal is pointing in the same direction. And what does this imply? And one can of course also ask, are they realistic? These principles point at a kind of vaccine cosmopolitanism. Cosmopolitanism is an old view in political philosophy, as you know. You can go back to Diogenes, you can go to Mauson, the Chinese philosophy, you can go to Immanuel Kant and others to find this view that every human being, irrespective of nationality, have some basic rights, same rights. The moral cosmopolitanism. And when we apply it to vaccination, it means that they have the same rights to vaccination against fatal viruses. That's my interpretation of vaccine cosmopolitanism. And what we saw from these world leaders is that was exactly what they were arguing for, some kind of vaccine cosmopolitanism. What does it then apply? What are the basis for this idea about cosmopolitanism, moral cosmopolitanism, and also when it comes to the distribution of vaccine? Well, first, I think we can have it as a basis as a principle of human dignity or human welfare, or you can formulate it in a different way. But the idea that each human life is of equal importance and each human life is equally valuable. This basic principle is very difficult to object to. There is no reason why person, because of the skin color or because of IQ or whatever, should have some more value than anyone else. Argument for that would be then very, very difficult and it's very problematic also in historical politics. This has happened. So the principle of human dignity would be one reason or one basis for cosmopolitanism, and in this way also vaccine cosmopolitanism. Another, which in the ethical discussion it's labeled luck egalitarianism, says shortly that no one should be worse off because of her poor luck in the natural lottery. This idea means that if you happen to be born by parents with high IQ or with high wealth and so on, or if you happen to be born by poor parents, that should not decide your life, because that's a part of the natural lottery. What should affect your own life and your circumstances must be based on your own decisions. And of course, even to be born in Sweden or be born in say Mali is just a matter of lottery. So with this principle, luck egalitarianistic principle, you can say that, okay, this also speaks for kind of cosmopolitanism when it comes to distribution. Everyone has the same right to the vaccine. However, I said that this is I think these, we talk about values here. I think these are kind of universal values, which everyone, irrespective of background, philosopher have difficulties to object against. But of course, vaccine nationalism, which has been the label for what is really happening today, could also in some way be backed up and have some intuitively moral force, that citizenship is a relevant factor for decision of priorities. One can argue that government is based on contractual obligations entailing moral of trust, solidarity, and promises. Political leaders have primary obligations to their fellow citizens. That seems to be also we expect from our politicians that they should do the best they can for us in the special nation. And we can see that these two principles, vaccine cosmopolitan and vaccine nationalism, would come into conflict. Is there a possibility to find a middle way here then? I think so, and I call it a modified cosmopolitanism. It was first said that states have the right to act in accordance with their obligations to their citizens, generally. It seems to be quite a reasonable principle. As long as the global population has sufficient level of resources for living a good life. That would be the sort of the proviso. When people are dying in other countries, then there must be some modification to governments' right to follow or obligation to just act for their own citizens, because then the values are so much severe that is at stake here. This can also be called global sufficientism, which is also kind of this kind of ethical concepts that I will introduce here. And global sufficientism implies that each human being, irrespective of nationality, has the same right to be vaccinated against COVID-19. But this is a fatal, dangerous pandemic, and states have then rights, and especially then governments in rich countries, as long as to prioritize their own population, but only when no global population has got sufficient level of vaccines. If this is realized, then where you live does not decide whether you live, at least not regarding to the corona pandemic. Let me now finally say something about the practical implications of such a modified cosmopolitanism. In Sweden now, and we are engaged in that in my council, we are discussing should we now vaccinate small children? They are not hit by the pandemic, very, very slightly hit. For the whole community, it could be perhaps, but that's very debated, some advantages. But should we really use our vaccines that we have in Sweden to vaccinate children between 5 and 12 who are not suffering from this pandemic, when not even healthcare personnel in poor countries? I think one implication of this modifier is that we shouldn't, because there is no moral reasons for that. The booster doses, the third, perhaps even talk about fourth doses for people should wait until the vaccines are distributed. For example, distributed to COVAX, the initiative, which was started very early, and I think this article that I quoted in the beginning from Washington Post also was in line with the goal of COVAX, which means that rich countries should increase the donations to low-income countries through COVAX and in other ways. So these donations must be prioritized to the vaccination of small children in our rich countries, if we should be able to morally justify what we are doing during this coronavirus. Another discussion that has started is who should be able to produce vaccines. Waiver from certain provisions of the TRIPS agreement for prevention, containment, and treatment of COVID-19. India and South Africa proposed to the World Trade Organization that the property rights around the production of vaccines should be waived during this period. That would be also in line with the statutes of the WTO and what is called the Doha Amendment, which allows countries to produce vaccines, generic vaccines, when in case of urgency. And according to India, South Africa, and hundreds of other countries now in the WTO, this is exactly the case. Even the US, who usually protect the private property rights very hard, President Biden has supported this initiative. France, Macron also, but the EU is an obstacle, stand against it. Even my own country, Sweden, which has led to that this decision has not been taken so far. This could, especially in the long run, increase the possibility to produce vaccines. So as we can see this from the editorial, the journal Nature, arguing here for a patent waiver of COVID vaccines is right and fair. And that would also be in line, I think, with this principle that if you live, where you live should not decide whether you live. Increased production of COVID vaccines. And here the conflict is against those who protect private property rights of vaccines and pharmaceuticals. This initiative, of course, in line with what we're talking about, also one of the practical implications. Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine to be sold to develop at cost price, which was a decision taken by the company. All efforts have to be now put into this effort to vaccinate poor people, and this is otherwise how we will, even this time, see the world. And no one is safe until everyone is safe. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Göran, for this extremely interesting presentation. I think we are slightly lagging behind our schedule, but we can have roughly 15 minutes for discussion. And I would like to use the privilege of chairing this session to raise the first question, which is also a reflection on Göran's presentation. I don't have time for Professor Lee just now. Personally, I totally share the values that you formulate, and it's very easy for me to agree with the principles that you have formulated. Yet, listening to you, I would like to raise a question which is a little bit of a question that could be posed by the devil's advocate. And I raise this as a question. It's not an argument, it's a question. You started out by telling us about how much different countries spend on medical care. And you pointed out, I didn't write down the figures, but the US spends more than twice as much as Sweden. And Sweden in turn spends several times as much as Congo or Bangladesh. Then during your talk, I checked the statistics on the number of deaths per 1 million people in these countries. And then we find, of course, that by far the greatest percentage of deaths you find in the US, where yesterday, I think 2,428 deaths per 1 million have been recorded. And the second highest figure is Sweden, among the countries that you cited. In Sweden, 1,485 deaths per 1 million people have been reported. Whereas in Bangladesh, the figure given, perhaps the statistics are not reliable, but anyway, the figures that I found was 168, and in Congo only 62. It would be interesting to hear your comments on this. Does this mean that living in Sweden is more dangerous than, as far as COVID-19 is concerned, than living in Congo?
That's a very relevant question, of course, although it does not really affect the principles that I've been arguing for. I mean, it's another argument, discussion, of course, but the reasons here, and I'm not an epidemiologists, even if many of us are becoming amateuristic epidemiologists this year. Well, one explanation is, of course, that the coronavirus hit elderly mostly when it comes to the fatal consequences, and because of poverty, the populations in these countries, in the low-income countries, are lower. So therefore, they don't get up to some ages when they are really suffer, when they can die from the COVID. It is also a fact that some countries have not been affected because there is no communication, global communication. They are not part of the kind of they are not being infected by it. In some of the countries, other poor countries, Peru is have been really hard hit by the coronavirus. So it differs between some of these countries. And also third comment to this is that we should not only, I think, count the death by the corona, we should also count the death by poverty that has increased due to corona because of the lockdowns. In many of the African countries have been lockdowns, which has decreased their already from the beginning very low level of income, and where people are living also on the borderline between survival and extreme poverty, which is and also causes bad health and so on. So if we also include the death caused by the lockdowns in these countries who have no healthcare resources to protect themselves if they get the virus into the countries, I think the figures would be different. So there are different ways to comment on this. So I think we should be very cautious when we look at these statistics, but they are of course right, as you say, that this is, and from Sweden we know why this is so the high death rate, because of the poor elderly care, which is also one of the real weak parts of our welfare system, which has been very obvious through this pandemic. So in the US, which is have a high figure on healthcare resources, at the same time, it's so unequal divide. So parts of the US have but the healthcare in the level of African countries, while others, because of the high spending, can do whatever they want when it comes to healthcare. I think there's a lot of different kind of modification when you compare the statistics.
And let me repeat that I did not try to make the argument that there was anything basically wrong with your principle.
I know, but it's a good question.
The statistics are striking. So I think if somebody poses the question, could it be that people in Sweden and the US are in greater need of this particular vaccine than people, say, in the Congo? These questions could at least be taken seriously. Although I mean, you have pointed out a number of factors now that we should be aware of when we discuss this. I shouldn't take up too much time. Other questions, please, for Professor Lee Mauson and for Göran.
I think Dixon has raised his hand.
Yes, please. And please unmute yourself, Dixon.
Okay, thank you, Professor Lee and Göran, for the talks. I just have maybe one comment for Professor Lee. I like the way you introduced Confucianism. I hadn't seen it that way, but I wanted to ask: is it guiding the overall national politics in China, or it has been affected by a lot of Western concepts of governance and capitalism and all that? Just wanted to hear your opinion on that. And then for Professor Göran, there's a problem with, there are some countries that have tried to donate vaccines, but I think there's something that pops up. Some of the vaccines either are donated when they are about to expire, they have expired. So the principle may be good, but the practice may have some attendant ethical issues. I don't know what your comment would be on that.
Please, would you like to respond, Professor Lee?
Yes, thank you very much for the question. Dixon, I didn't hear you very clearly. Is your question the white paper is a result from foreign pressures, or you have the idea about Confucianism, or you have a question about a white paper about the Chinese way of fighting the epidemic?
It's the white paper. Is it guided by Confucianism, or
no. No, the white paper is not guided by Confucianism. My speech has two emphases. One is that some people misunderstood Confucianism, or they understand them in an incomplete way, not complete. My opinion is that according to the ancient understanding, like in the dictionary of 说文解字, Confucianism is understood or is described as soft. But this soft is not the physical soft as we understand now. It implies the growth of plants, like something in the Aristotelianism, for example, flourishing. To people strive for excellency and to reach eudaimonia, to reach flourishing. So Confucianism, the original intention is to make people grow well. But the white paper is a document of the Chinese government. It has some implication that life in Chinese moral ideology is emphasized very much. For example, even much than the modern ideas of human rights. During the pandemic, Australian businesswoman, she tried to juggling, to keep fit without wearing mask. All people, Chinese people, criticized her. And finally, she was an employee of the Australian drug pharmacy, and she lost her job because of that. Yeah, so it's during the pandemic, there are a lot of conflicts of ideas about rights, about welfare. At that time, we have little knowledge about the virus. We were only afraid of it because it's transparent so secretly. Nobody knows who carries it. That's a problem. So now we understand that if everybody is safe, when everybody is safe, and we will be safe. So yeah, sorry for this.
No, thank you very much. And you
yes, I can comment the question both by Dixon, but also by Mats Engman, who has written a question on the chat function here. I think they are in the same line. So Dixon's question about the practical implication of these donations that has been problematic because in some cases the vaccines donated have been those who was not the countries in the rich part of the world didn't want to use. AstraZeneca was used in the beginning, for example. I got both my vaccines, AstraZeneca, but then it was shown that it had some disadvantages, and then all the vaccines of AstraZeneca was then donated to poor countries, low income, which says something about also this priority of the equal value of human life, but that's another story. But then some of them also were getting out of time, as Dixon correctly mentioned, which make them in any way impossible to use. So of course that's a lot of practical implication. Mats Engman's question on the chat function says that find the ethical principles attractive, and I would just comment on this principle because sometimes when we talk about global justice, moral cosmopolitan, it sounds it can be very idealistic. So it can be a sort of utopian in some way, which I think in some way we should be utopian in ethics. I mean, we should say that the Kantian principle of not lying and keeping our contracts, etc., are basically both idealistic and utopian, but they are still justifiable. So ethics has this aspect. Even utilitarianism is in some way very idealistic, but it's also part of why ethics is always challenging the practice. But I've tried then to formulate this more modified principle, taking into consideration also that we have the reasons to say that governments have some reason also to prioritize their own population. But as Mats Engman points out, when we try to put into practice these ideas, for example, when it comes to COVID-19 vaccines, we have taken into consideration, as he said, the management capability, the political leadership, the infrastructure capability in those receiving countries, and that's a lot of work to be done there, of course. So in order for these vaccines to really reach those who need it, so I completely agree with his question, his comment there. So I think these were the two questions that I got. Now I think Professor Lee has also some question here in the chat function, but you can take that maybe, Torbjörn.
Thank you. We have 3 more presentations after the coffee break, so I think we should wind up very soon. But we have one more question also in the chat box that for Professor Lee that I can read to you. The question is posed by Elisabeth Ferido Bolin, who writes as follows. My question to Professor Lee: from the standpoint of the Confucian moral and ethical values, kindness, transparency, equality, etc., what do you say, Professor, about how the present Chinese leadership handled the virus from the beginning, meaning its origin from Wuhan before it spread worldwide?
Yes, I read the question. It's really complicated. Yeah. I just said now, presented up till now, we have much knowledge about the virus, but the very beginning, nobody knows about it. In 2003, we had the experience of SARS. At that time, when people felt that the SARS virus could be spread by breath, by the air, all society are set into a kind of disorder, because there was no trust between people. But for the Wuhan virus, it's an experience, I think, for them not to tell at the very beginning what the nature of the virus was. If they see the virus was spreading through air, the whole society will be put into disorder again, because people have no confidence. The trust between people will be lost. So I think it's a big decision, very, very difficult decision for them to lock down, for Wuhan lockdown. It's not a decision to lock down the Helsinki, the city of Helsinki, because there are few people here. If you lock down Wuhan, that means a very, very big decision. Yeah. So there are some records and writings, reports about it. Of course, there are some controversial ideas about it. Yeah. So nowadays we have more experience and we have more lessons. We know when sometimes it's necessary to lock down. But still, some people say, no, there are no such virus at all. It's a conspiracy. It's not true. It doesn't matter. I can bear it. But until we have some, until we have some power to beat it. So we are very weak, especially for the elderly people.
Thank you, Professor Lee. And I think we have one more question, but we have to be rather strict about timing. However, I think that we can continue our webinar until 12:45. So for that reason, I now suggest that we have our coffee or tea break and reconvene again at 10:50 for Professor Xiong Bingzhan's presentation. Presentations ahead of us. The first presentation will be by Professor Xiong Bingzhan, or Bingzhan Xiong, who is the Secretary General of CIPSH, and CIPSH means, as most of you now know, the International Council for Philosophy and Human Sciences. It is also very important, plays a crucial role in the CIPSH Academy on Chinese Cultures and Humanities. Professor Xiong is also the holder of the CIPSH Chair in New Humanities at the University of California in Irvine. Besides, I think you also have chairs, don't you, in Hong Kong and in Taipei. Professor Xiong received her PhD in history from Brown University and her SM in population studies and international health from Harvard University. Her research interests lie in the areas of women's and children's health, public health, society, technology, and medicine, late imperial and modern China, comparative cultural and social history, and gender studies on population. So you can notice that Professor Xiong is a scholar with far-reaching, broad interests. Her works include the books A Tender Voyage, Children and Childhood in Late Imperial China, Childhood in the Past, A History of Chinese Children, and Ill or Well, Diseases and Health of Young Children in Late Imperial China. So with these words, it's my privilege to give the word to Professor Xiong for her presentation entitled Ambivalent Pleasure, Crickets in Chinese History. Please, Bingzhan.
Yeah, thank you, Professor Lun. Let me, good morning. Let me do the screen share with you. The screen, 我没有办法在这个 screen share 按啊，screen share 不能够按，我已经按了，就是你不要这几分钟不在了，我现在已经按了，但是没有办法出现。Which is it? Okay, let me begin, and as we put on the screen share. One outstanding challenge we realized during the ongoing pandemic in the past 2 years, it's the undeniable human need for social life and daily entertainment. And we want to ask ourselves, how best should we appreciate this and to handle this when requirements on mask wearing, social distancing, personal isolation with the pandemic control threatens to deny people these basic needs. This morning, I would like to introduce to you the case of Chinese people's long love affair with crickets to try to throw additional light on the kind of ethical problems people used to struggle with, which were never far from the ways that they chose to amuse themselves. I shall do so by going over 4 stages of this Chinese encountering with their playmates, the crickets, over the millennium. All right, so I think it's clear that people play, or, as the Chinese text would say, that people must play, including the kings. And it takes imagination and creativity to enter into this partly fantasy world. There is a long love affair between the Chinese people and their playmates. Cricket is a curious one. But these evolving fascination also had always existed side by side with changing moralities. So to many, it could be a fatal attraction, as I would show you later. And the audacity to play is what that society and the culture asks of their people to some sort of attractions that never ends. Whether people should be allowed or encouraged to play, or how should they play properly in the matter of amusement. Let me show you this. I will come back to this. I noticed this when I was visiting the Macau Museum, which shows the silver coffin of the last champion cricket itself. And that's before the Vegas of the Orient surfaced 5 centuries ago. From the very beginning, there is an attraction between the Chinese people as agrarian settlers with their seasonal lives. And so this is in a way related to the other theme of this conference, namely climate change, although in the seasonal and at the micro level. Let me show you 2 verses from Book of Odes, and this is from about close to 3,000 years ago, when they say that as the year is drawing to a close, this is a song, a verse, sort of read to the king, saying that if we do not enjoy ourselves now, the days and months will be leaving us. So in a way, it's a reminder, a cautionary one, to say that remember to play and to relax. On the other hand, almost simultaneously, the verse says that please let us not to go to great excess and think of the duties of our position. And so, we need to do this amusement thoughtfully and not go wild. So this is the Guofeng, the verse that's named after cricket. Then there's another ode that's, described the human observation of the crickets from the 5th lunar month to the 6th, 7th, 8th, 9th, to the 10th, when the poet's voice say that the cricket, their pal, started to crawl underneath my bed. A personal voice appeared. And this is certainly anthropocentric, and many arts attest to this very intimate affair. Chinese over centuries had given nomenclature, different names to these creatures, either grass chicken or a skipping horse under the stove, or eventually the dwelling heroic bug. one thing, and so passing the high antiquity by the medieval times, people were attracted by the sound these creatures made. The town court ladies had been noted to be attracted to this melodramatic singing, although the moralists then say that the voices that these bugs made was really meant to be a reminder for the women to go to their looms to weave. And so these crickets that used to be called, grass chicken or what have you, now wore the name of 处之, reminder to weave, or even lazy women, lazy lady. Because that, if these moralists thought if they can get cricket sounds or name crickets to remind the women to go to their looms, then maybe, indirectly the husbands or brothers and sons would also remember to go to their study. So that's the second stage. So you see that, there's a natural attraction, there's a playful relationship, but the moralists and ethics were always close. The third stage I want to sort of very briefly sketch for you, this high drama, which really started very, ordinarily when Song children discovered that they could make some crickets, the male ones, to fight. The zoologists today will tell you crickets by nature are very, very shy bugs. Over 116 kinds of them, only one kind, the males, could be compelled or forced to fight. They're not fighty bugs. But the Chinese children discovered that, and the Chinese men and women managed. All right, so which led to this one high drama I want to explain to you. When the Southern Song prime minister had been recorded in Chinese official history as being crawling down on the floor, obsessed with cricket fights, while the whole empire, its capital, was falling to the Mongols. So how should we read this? It's a notorious story of a bad minister, or for the ordinary people, somehow very peculiarly, curiously, they decided to really take on a different side, to believe that what Jia Sidao stood for, this prime minister of theirs, it's one that believed in deeper, more truthful love affair, as a testimony to humanity, humanity's unstoppable, incurable need to play, to relax, and to stay truthful, and have the audacity and the guts and ultimate commitment to play. All right, this is how the prime minister looks like in Chinese drama. Here's a Sichuan opera performance of Jia Sidao. For people who know the Chinese drama will recognize that this is a very, very ambivalent, complicated, sphenic sort of view, and that's the original text. I won't read you the original text from the official Song history, saying that as the falling of the capital became imminent, Jia set himself every day, and with gamblers surrounded by concubines, and for the licentious pleasure. And you could read the text, the Chinese text, saying the emperor had been said to be squatting on the ground with his courtiers doing, obsessed with cricket fighting. Other than this text is 1.5 line, we have no other evidence to see whether this event actually took place. But this is how, on the one side, the official history had sort of let down its stamp against, cricketified as the quintessential, the supreme of the terrible gambling of games. On the other hand, here I show you a Ming print. These Ming prints on bug classics. It's ironic enough to call that classics, 重经, classics of bugs. You saw 处之, they name, quick to weave the bugs. But these were the name of the evil, presumably evil, prime minister as an attraction to all of his fans, believers of games and plays in the later empire. Let me show you now some physical evidence of this. You could see them in textual forms, or in the objects themselves. The instruments that prick the crickets out of grassy grounds, the fans and the catcher, to catch them. I myself still has a scar on my knee that I fell on broken glass when I was trying to catch a huge bug when I was 3 years old. And once they're caught, they have their residence. You saw those as the dwelling pot, passing corridors, and drinking cups. These are not only could be made of gold and precious stone, and for the artisans who produce them, they sign their names. There's a huge market that carries on to Shanghai, Shandong today. Shandong province now still has a research institute of crickets. Back 15 years ago, when I was visiting Shanghai and Beijing, these bugwares markets, a bug could cost 1.5 years of a librarian's salary. So speaking of attractions of play, on your left-hand side of the screen is the formal engagement invitation to come to play. And then, on the number 2, you see this the weighing scale with these tiny, tiny creatures. They're like the boxers. They're divided into different categories by weight. So half a drop of water, sip of water, half grain of rice could tip the scale. And they have these in number 3 and 4. You saw them, they were carried maybe just, slightly 1 or 2 months before now, when the weathers got to be cold, and they carry these bugs, their champions, to these fighting games with warmers, heated carriers. What I'm trying to show you is that these are things that people could hold very dear to their heart. Each of the bug carry personalized names with full biographies. Here's one I'm showing you. When I have time, I could read them about this admiral. It's called Admiral of the Green Wings, with a birth date, birthplace, each of the games that have been fought and eventually passed away with honor, with the full funeral celebration of the life. By the Qing times, there were dramas, performances, when each actor and actresses were playing a bug. And that's the category, the catalog. We may call them a Hall of Fame in honor of heroic bugs, each of them with their names golden yellow, true dark green, big yellow head with waxy leg, and so on and so forth. So Chinese people's fascination and encounter with the crickets since antiquity to the present day, continues. It's a very everyday, ordinary thing that museums around you, next time you go to San Francisco or Macau, you could see them. I've read you some different sections from the Book of Odes, the classics, and the official history that show you the attraction of that. And basically, what they're saying is that to relax is important to kings and beggars alike, that they are unstoppable, even if prime ministers were to witness the falling of their empire and the capital. We may say that cricket or the fighting fits the post-Song, the second millennium, as a particular kind of amusement in a number of ways. One, that it requires less physical space and time as the empire moved from the more spacious northern plain to the crowded southern cities, towns and cities, whereby people were getting increasingly busy and they need a fitful way to play. This game appeared to be less violent, not like the old gladiator type or sumo wrestling kind of beastly, bloody games. It suited the neo-Confucian, new moralist type of philosophical taste that demands for a more civilized, increasingly abstract form of amusement. So they had gone virtue. When I lecture, last time I had my colleagues from Tencent company who design electronic games now, and they say this game basically had everything in place now that they're remarketing. In any event, in actuality, it grips everybody's heart intensely exactly because it appears to be manageable and compatible to the lifestyle of the contemporaries in terms of the scheduling. So crickets live only for 3 to 5 weeks. And it has the sensibility and the temperament that fits the late imperial people, including the moralists, inclination for the rightful way to play. But the moralists, of course, or the ethic, people are quick to note the ambivalence, the trouble with this kind of play, because in the 17th century, people like Yuan, Chinese authors say that as people, ordinary people, were going up to the countryside to sweep ancestral graveyard, this is in the autumn, their eyes, men, women, especially children, were eye-open because they were really looking for crickets under the grasses. So these may be points worthwhile considering as we continue to reflect about the world of amusement, social life, of taste. There are many, many artistic drawings that preserve for scholars an extraordinary case of humanity's uninhibited desire to play, for its sanity, for marking the normalcy of life under all circumstances. To summarize, Chinese people's relationship with crickets have been marked with reminders of the importance of pleasure, but never excessively. And when you hear the sound, the moralists would like to say, they should be reminders to weave, to study, and not go lazy. Prime ministers were noted down, as, staying truthful to his love, not the empire, but the crickets, or, the person could risk knowing that his name would go down as evil ministers, or that others would say that the person, Jia Sidao, had finally won himself as the king of the underground for all players and playings. How should we read such tales of falling for merry-making as incurable attachments? These continued and continues to this day. The Great Cultural Revolution was the only time when the game had been shut down against imperial times, when they could give recess to court ceremonies to give everybody a holiday to play. The people keep over 300 bucks for a season. So in looking at the pots and silver coffins, which bear evidence of gambling and gamblers, whether it's in the back alleys of Macau, I bought one in the ordinary antique shops. I think, you could read this encyclopedia literature, which I'm doing, with letters, and the films and novels continue to attest. The first film that emerged out of the Great Cultural Revolution, called Xi Zao, taking a bath, began with two older gentlemen lying down in the bathhouse, bathing house, talking about their bugs. It is one of the stories that tell us about the ambivalence of pleasure, ambivalence and ethical struggles may stay at the core that defines pleasure as something that's natural and ordinary. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Xiong. I think you have drawn our attention to an important theme, that is the significance of play, of amusement, of pleasure, really, in human life. And I think this is worthwhile, not least to a Western audience, since many people in the West, many of us, perhaps also many Chinese people, tend to associate traditional China and traditional Chinese culture with a rather ascetic and prohibitive view of pleasures. But I think that in China, just like in Europe, there are different currents of different strands of attitudes to game and pleasure. There is this, indeed, this ascetic and prohibitive view in China that we associate perhaps with some forms of neo-Confucianism and also other currents of thought. But there is also the much more allowing, much more positive view of pleasure and game and play. And the significance of this, not least in difficult times, such as our time now. And likewise, similarly, I think in Europe, you can also distinguish between different views. In Europe, we have the tradition of viewing man as a homo ludens, playing man. But there are also much stricter, much more moralistic currents. For sake of time, I think we have to save all questions until later and move on at once to the next presentation, which will be given by my friend, Professor Louis Osterbeck, who is the president of CIPSH. Louis is also professor of archaeology at the Polytechnic Institute of Tomar and holder of the UNESCO chair in Humanities and Cultural Integrated Landscape Management. His research focuses on the transition to Southern America. He also researches heritage and food producing economies in Portugal, Africa, and landscape management. And he's, that I already said, he's president of CIPSH. Professor Osterbeck is the author of, notice this, over 300 papers and 70 books. 70 books is almost, I think, 10 times as many books as I have written, including From Humankind Towards Humanity, Through Epidemics and Social Cultural Cohesion. It's great to have you here, Louis. The floor is yours, please.
Thank you very much, Torbjörn. Again, I would like to apologize everyone for not having joined yesterday. I had some technical difficulties on my side, but hopefully today is running well. I'm not an expert in ethics, as you may know. I'm a prehistorian, working also on landscape management and interested in ethics. I'm bringing here some reflections, which I kindly ask you to read as the observations of a prehistorian about contemporary life, and not more than that. The hypothesis I'm raising here is that we are experiencing an acceleration of processes in our society that have their roots in what I think it's the beginning of the disruption of the system structured after the Second World War in the early 1970s, and accelerated further after 2008, and now leading to something qualitatively different with. I will not be discussing ethics. I'm more interested in understanding how ethics as a collective, a community understanding of values operates in the context of these changes. And I think that some indicators are arising. On top of them, I would say the defense of life. Not only individual lives, not only of own lives, but of one's life. And this is an interesting feature that I think emerges from the last 2 years. But it's not only that. I think also we are in the moment of a shift from a more individual-centered approach, which dominated the last decades, particularly from the 1960s onwards, to a more collective rights approach. And I will go back to that. And I think this will have implications, for example, in the understandings of what people perceive as being good or bad, and also how they perceive their own identities and the relation to others. Very briefly, I think we have a series of trends. People talk about that. And these trends have an effect in terms of leading to what I think is a new global depression. When I talk about global depression, I'm making a parallel with the 1929-1946 depression, and even before that, the 1873-1896 depression. These depressions are different from the cyclic crisis of capitalist system, because they are not merely a reorganization of supply and demand, but they are a transformation of the system which combines a change in the energy system, a monetary important transformation as well, a disruption of the labor market, and in general, leading to new sets of values. And we have seen that in the end of the 18th century, we have seen that in the turn to the 20th century, and I think we are experiencing now something alike. We are still in the early stages in that respect. The financial disruption is very clear. we don't have a universally accepted invariant. The dollar is no longer as strong as it was. The combination of currencies is unclear. And one major player, which is China, does not play exactly with the same rules. We have a digital transition, which is basically leading to a contradiction between economic growth and growth of jobs. In fact, the economy grows at the pace of the destruction of jobs. And this creates, again, an impact in society and raises questions about even the value of labor in the definition of identities and the performance of individuals. And this, again, leads to a tension between individual and collective rights and institutional disruptive processes, which can be translated into daily policies in terms of the growing suspicions of individuals in relation to institutions. For a long time, this has been discussed, but this suspicion of individuals in relation to institutions that characterizes most of democratic regimes, but also the non-democratic regimes, is now leading, I think, to something else, which is a new type of organization. We have seen one expression of that most of us don't like, but it's a fact, which is the role of social media and social media networks and the organization of public debate in silos, if we can still call it a debate. But we are seeing some other things now, and I think the pandemic is accelerating that. On one hand, it's accelerating a sort of extreme movements and discourses, which are very similar to things we have seen in the past. They are millenarist speeches, and the word emergency that comes over and over into the debate as a pre-historian, and even I think as an historian, it's nothing new. It's an expression of despair, and in the end, it will lead nowhere because it has no real alternative to the complexity of things. One thing that characterizes the extremes is that they don't reflect in depth. They are incapable of taking the complexity of the contradictions of processes, and they think easy solutions are possible. But on the other hand, we have a growing participation in society. And this is clear in all societies. It's clear, of course, in the democratic societies, it's more evident because communication is easier, but it's very strong in other regimes. And the attention these other regimes must pay to the participation of people, which is a form, if you wish, of democracy, is an interesting sign of the times we are living. And then there are these two elements, life and radicalism. Radicalism, I take it here in the against extremism. The difference being that radicalism is to go deep into the roots, which I think it's our duty as scholars. Indicators of this. One surprise that I think I had, and many of us possibly had as well. For the first time in history, the reaction of the majority of people across different traditional traditions, different cultures, different regions, different philosophical backgrounds, the reaction was, let's protect the community. This was, as we all know, this was not the response, even in face of the last big pandemic, the flu of 1918. The solution was always in the past to isolate those who were ill and to protect the remaining, those who were okay, not that much for their lives and their security, but for the general affairs of society to go on. The idea was always, let's keep the economy running. Some people, we must say, many governments most governments have actually taken this path again this time. The difference being that people refused. And that's the interesting thing. If people had not refused to follow the majority of people, I'm not talking about the minorities that came into the streets making demonstrations against protective measures. I'm talking about those who stood at home, which were the absolute majority, not only in Lisbon or Stockholm. They were the majority in Rio de Janeiro, they were the majority in Beijing, they were the majority in Buenos Aires, and they were the majority in Lagos. They were the majority everywhere. This is probably a cultural expression of globalization, because cultures, as we know, are in direct relations to the social and economic processes as well. And finally, we have an interesting positive effect. There is an alignment, and this alignment is in the direction of the protection of each individual life, beyond the concerns on economy, which of course exist. People are not stupid, they understand this as sometimes dramatic consequences. So this is an interesting feature. If it was not like that, we would have many more millions of people dead in this moment. And we have very few, in fact, if we take the whole population of the Earth, if we compare with the 50 to 55 millions of people that died 100 years ago, more or less, with the previous pandemic. And actually the numbers of people that died in previous big epidemics. There is this divide between individuals and institutions, and I think there is for the first time a notion of humanity emerging, a notion that is not simply what we learn in school and we repeat mechanically, but then of course most people remain completely ethnocentric. This time, and we have seen it, for example, in Brazil, the way one specific ethnic group, the Yanomami, have been treated by the Brazilian government led to a surge of contestation against the government, which was actually the first big problem of the current Brazilian government, which is very interesting. The current government lost a large part of its electoral basis precisely because of the many ethnic group that under normal, in brackets, circumstances would not be the focus of attentions for the majority. But then we have also seen other things, and there are values in dispute. The value of freedom, for example, and some studies have been conducted. I have conducted one of studies very early. I did that in the first wave, and I got with my students an interesting result, which at the time I undervalued because I thought it was due to a biased sample. We were working at distance. We couldn't reach. We didn't have a completely controllable sample. We were dependent on those people who had access to internet and so on. But then I saw other studies that led to the same conclusion. Only a third of the population that we had made an inquiry on, and now there are, as I said, studies which go further, only a third thinks that individual freedom is a core issue in our society. This is very interesting, as it is very interesting that the discussion about death penalty is coming back, including in countries that have banned it for a long time. I'm saying this because I'm not talking about what is positive or negative. I'm trying to bring you what are my observations about the situation. I think that we are in a tension between utopia, in the correct sense of the word, trying to imagine something that doesn't exist yet, but that will find eventually its place, and revival. The institutions, the governments I would say all of them, or almost all of them, and I would include universities in that, are thinking of the past. The whole project of the future is to go back to 2019, as if 2019 was a great place to stay. And then there are movements in direction of utopia. One thing that surprised me in the study I've conducted in 2020 was that the absolute majority, over 90% of the people we have interviewed a bit more than 700 people. It was a sample with difficulties, as I mentioned, but in Portugal, in Brazil, and then for leadership also in some other European countries. And over 90% of the people considered that they expected that in 5 years' time, they would be happier than they were a year before. It means when there was no pandemic. The same question asked to leaders of institutions, universities, churches, governments, companies, and so on, the absolute majority again were saying we will be worse off in 5 years. So institutions, actually, or leaders of institutions, if you wish, were looking at the future with a dark side, whereas individuals were already, that this is my reading, probably adapting, probably changing their expectations. We are happy or unhappy, not because of reality, but because of our expectations about reality. And this is interesting. We have today several challenges, everyone knows and talks about it. The problems of consumption, of accessibility, of borders. We have had previous interventions today about the issue of vaccine, for example, and who has access to that. We have the problem of migrations for a long time, and it will grow. We have challenges to redesign what are individual rights. And the responses we find from institutions are actually not in line with what people are asking for. The Green Deal talks about energy transition. It does not talk about behavior transformation. The response to the issue of vaccines is made through an approach on aid programs, which are better than nothing, of course, but sometimes embedded with some level of hypocrisy. And the case of AstraZeneca is peculiar among the different examples of hypocrisy in that. The reaction to the new variant of the virus found in Southern Africa, again, is an expression of that. There is the whole program, actually, of the institutions is to preserve themselves, which is normal, and to preserve their borders, national borders, institutional borders, and so on. And we know from the past, historians know that every time we have a combination of variables as we are having now, it will not happen. There will be a transformation. The only discussion is not if there will be the transformation, but if we can master it or not. And so far, my concern is that we are not doing that. I think there are new categories that are leading to new imperatives. Some of these may expand human rights, namely the focus on life, but some may also cancel. And I think we will see in the coming years strong discussions, particularly in the West. We are already seeing that. They are brought by the far right, but let's not be misled by that. The far right is bringing debates because it knows they have a ground. They are echoed in the society, and these debates are important. We have to address them. There is a new spirit of time, I think, and institutions that we have today need to transform themselves in order to grasp that zeitgeist. I don't think they are doing that. And I think there is this growing tension. The growing tension is always dangerous. It's positive in the sense that there will, every time there is an important transformation, and we need a transformation, individuals take the lead. But we also know that if nothing else happens, all we will have is chaos and war. And we are more in that direction than in another one. And now, to conclude, I would bring you just one specific example of how this general context, I think, can be declined probably in all spheres. And I'm bringing you one specific sphere because I know a bit of it, which are museums. And the ethical challenges in face of museums, and how the debates are being undertaken for a few years now, and even more now with the pandemic. The three ethical issues which I think are important, and they are at the heart of the debates today in museums. Everyone understands that the role of a museum is better played largely because people visiting the museum have not only a rational but also an emotional link to collections, to remains of the past, to artistic creations. And there is a big discussion in the world of museums about should the discourse of the museum be structured on top of those emotions, which will of course attract more people and provide them with a better feeling in terms of happiness, immediate happiness, or should it focus more on the rational, science-based, including human science-based interpretation of the past, of art, and so on. So should the museum privilege the sensitive approach? This is what many do today, knowing, however, that the sensitive approach reinforces ethnocentric appropriations. Whichever ethnocentric appropriations we are talking about, including of traditional communities, only the rational response allows to build.
Now you disappeared, Louise. Han är borta hos dig också. Can anybody else hear me?
To a convergent approach. So this is the first level of discussion. The second example is if in this context of the spirit of the time, should the museums have an agenda of engagement in the societal debates, or should they remain in a more academic stance without engaging? Actually, this discussion also exists in university, and the question being, what is the ethical response? What is the best response? If the museum or the university, in this case, becomes engaged, it will probably serve in the immediate time the needs of the people in the street. But at the medium long term, actually, it's reducing the scope of diversity and of the autonomy of reasoning of people. So what should be the response? And finally, how should museums translate the complexity of the past into the contemporary society? Because the past is charged with pain. If the museums disguise this pain, they will be simplifying the past. And in a sense, they will not be preparing people for what is ahead of them, the difficulties of the future. On the other hand, have the museums the right to add anxiety to people who are already experiencing anxiety every day, knowing that many of these people go to museums to release themselves a little bit from the difficulties of everyday life. And my last point is a question related to ethics. Could museums, through aesthetics and the concept of aesthetics, become actually an avenue to bring together these divides, these ethical concerns, to do a better job? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Luis, for sharing this fascinating historical perspective of the human predicament today. We have now less than an hour left of this webinar, so let us use the remaining hour as best we can. The final speaker today will be Dr. Soray Hongladarom, and since he's a good friend of Göran Kolstes, I will ask Göran to introduce and chair his presentation. Please, Göran.
Thank you. Yes, I've met Soray several times in different conferences, especially on ICT ethics, which he's an expert on. He's professor of philosophy and director of the Center for Science, Technology and Society at Chulalongkorn University in Bangkok, Thailand. Published books and articles on bioethics, computer ethics, role of science and technology. He's author of The Ethics of AI and Robotics, a Buddhist Viewpoint, The Online Self, Buddhist Theory of Privacy. And he also participated in an anthology that I was editing, Roman and Littlefield, on ethics and communication, where he also presented a Buddhist perspective on this issue. And today he will talk about thinking about intercultural ethics at the time of the global pandemic. So welcome, Soray.
Yes, thank you very much for your introduction, Göran. And my apologies for having missed the yesterday's session. I was very busy, and there was some miscommunication about my presentation. I was not given, or I could not find the program of the event, but anyway, has been sorted out. So I'm sharing my screen now. I don't think I will spend too much time talking about what I'm going to talk about today. And I'm going to talk about a small aspect of what is happening or what has happened in Thailand in relation to the COVID pandemic, especially as it concerns the use of information technology, especially contact tracing apps and location notification apps, and some ethical ramifications arising out of the use of these apps. And I will also look at the ethical ramifications through the lenses of intercultural ethics, especially Buddhist ethics. So quite a lot of things in this short talk. So it's a work in progress, and hopefully I will unpack this and provide some more details, elaborate the ideas and the research that I have been doing into something, in a more manageable form. Let's move on. So here's something about myself. Here's the outline. I will start with talking about the use of information technology to combat COVID-19 in Thailand. So a snapshot about what is happening, which is Thailand is, I think, is an interesting case because we have managed to keep the number of new infections very low, especially 2 years ago. Especially last year, sorry, in 2020. And then the number really shot up dramatically in December of last year, and then it came down. And then in April of this year, it just shot up to as many as 20,000. Please forgive me about the birds. They are singing right now. I have two birds in my house. 20,000 new cases, which was unprecedented because in 2020, it was around something fewer than 100 new cases every day for a long time. So the Thai government kind of was, what to say, they became too comfortable about their situation, and they did not take proactive action because they thought that the situation was under control. But it was proven, the government, the policy was proven wrong when the number really shot up in April. But now, due to wearing masks, universal requirement for everybody to wear masks, and social distancing, and periodic locking downs of the country, the number of new cases as of now today has been down to about 4,000 new cases, which is still quite a lot, but it's way down from the number in early of this year. So information technology has done its contribution in the effort of the country to fight the spread of the pandemic, but there are problems which I'm going to talk about. So these uses show many instances that illustrate the politics and technology that illustrate that politics and technology are interrelated. I will show the details later on. Sometimes another reason trumps over technological reasons. I mean, there are political motivations or some other motivations which are not really technical, because when we look at what technology can do, I come from the field of, as Yoran has introduced, the field of information ethics. So I look at the role that information technology plays in society, especially when everybody is concerned with the pandemic. But what is happening is that it's not only the technical reasons that govern how IT is being used to combat the spread of the pandemic, but there are other reasons as well. So that's the point. So Thai bureaucrats prefer to use a Ferrari to carry charcoal, and this has been something of a catchword in Thai media around the middle of this year, because they prefer to use very simple means, very simple uses of information technology to do their jobs, which is different from the original design of the computer scientists and programmers who designed these IT apps. I will talk about the details later on. So right now, the use of technology has receded into the background as of now. So people still rely on these tried and true methods of wearing masks. Everybody, it has become a habit of Thai people. Whenever they go out into the public, they have surgical masks or some other kinds of face masks. It's universal. You find everywhere in Thailand at the moment. And then I will end up with intercultural ethical reflection, especially what Buddhism has to say. So this is the abstract. I'm not going to read the whole thing, but just a proposal to think about what intercultural ethics could illuminate the situation that has been going on in my country. So the use of technology to combat the pandemic in Thailand. This is the name of one of the two main applications that Thai people know very well, because these two apps, and Thai Chana, you see the name here, is one of these two apps. And the government try to motivate, try to push these apps to the people. They encourage the people to download these apps to their mobile phones. And what Thai Chana does is that it's a location notification app. So I think in Taiwan, they are doing the same. Whenever you go to a public place, for example, a shopping mall or any stores inside a shopping mall, you will find a QR code, a square code that you need to scan. And everybody is encouraged, not required. That a tricky thing that and can be discussed in the context of my country also. Everybody is encouraged to scan their location. So whenever they enter a store, they have to scan. And then the information is collected in a central server. Such and such user of this such and such mobile phone number is entering such and such store at such and such a time. And when you finish your business at the store, when you go out, you have to scan it again. And you have to do this every time you go in and out any stores or shopping malls or any public places. The idea, of course, is to enable the central authority to know who's where, so that when there are new infected cases, they know who this newly infected person has been in contact with. So they will call up those people to have a test. So this is the original idea of the apps, and this is one of the contributions of information technology to help fight the pandemic. Okay, and this is the other app that I was talking about. It's called Mauson. It's in Thai language. It means Mo means doctor, and Chana means to win. So literally speaking, the app means doctors win. It's not people win. It should be people win, but the Thai words you see on the screen say doctors win. Perhaps doctors win when there are no more cases or newly infected cases, when they beat the pandemic, presumably. But what this app does is this. This is an analysis in a newspaper article, the price of safety, talking about the price that people have to pay in order to use this app. And this is the QR code that you have to scan that I just talked about. The idea of this app is this. you have to put in your personal information once you download the app. And what the app does is to notify you of the likelihood of getting close to someone who might have COVID. So I think this idea can be found in other countries also. So you have a mobile phone, and your mobile phone has to be connected at all times via Bluetooth, the central server. And the idea is that when everybody has their mobile phone connected via Bluetooth, so you know who's around you or which mobile phones are around you. And these mobile phones will contain information about the level of risk that the owners of the mobile phones have. So you can see on your mobile phone that there is a risky person, something like 3 or 4 meters from you. That's the idea. So you can make your own precaution, right? Doing social distancing or doing whatever is necessary. That's the idea. Of course, there are a lot of concerns with privacy issues and personal information. But the debate was in my country about, finding a balance between public health on the one hand and personal rights on the other. I think it's the same debate that other countries are having also. So I'm not going to read all of this, but this sums up what the application does. It's designed to identify individuals who have come into contact with COVID-19 patients using GPS and Bluetooth. Okay, so what happened after using the apps? The app was developed by a team who did not belong to the government. So they are just a team of computer scientists, and they volunteered their time and effort into developing these apps. However, the bureaucrats who controlled the resources available necessary for running and for producing the app interfered with their work. They demand that the app follow their own ideas other than the ideas of the original programmers of the app. This resulted in, and it became headline news in my country for a few weeks, at the middle of this year. This resulted in the whole volunteer team quitting the task of developing the app because they could not control what they are doing with their creation anymore, and they gave away the whole thing to the ministry, and the ministry didn't have enough competent programmers, so they try to use the apps their own way, and this can be summed up like this. The idea of the original designers is that the use of the app was to be peer-to-peer. I mean, mobile phones to mobile phones connecting with one another, right? However, the idea of the Ministry of Public Health is that each mobile phone needs to be connected to the central server belonging to the ministry itself. So instead of peer-to-peer, we are talking about one big hub, and each mobile phones are connected to hub. So it's a centralization of information. So that is different models of how to manage information. So a high-ranking bureaucrat at the ministry said that she did not care if she were to use a Ferrari, a sporty car, to carry charcoal. Meaning, if the app is such of a fancy thing and capable of doing so many things, she did not care. She wanted the app to do one or two things prescribed by the ministry only. So even if it's a Ferrari, if the ministry wanted it to carry charcoal, which is black and dirty, then that was it. Something and this was reported in the Thai media.
Sorry, 2 minutes left.
Yeah, sorry. So let's move on to my reflection of the matter, which is the last slide. Key idea of Buddhism is interdependence and compassion. So interdependence, very briefly, means everything is connected with one another. And compassion means you have a commitment to help other beings to be free from sufferings. And these are the two main pillars of Buddhism. This informs the ethical ideal of Buddhist ethics. The incidents that I have talked about reflects the attitude of the bureaucrats, which does not seem to be aligned with the idea. So it's a critique of ethical critique of what is happening, and it is related to how technology is used, and we look at interrelations of concepts, politics and democracy and technology and intercultural ethics. The attitude of the bureaucrats does not seem to reflect either interdependence or compassion. In any case, however, the app right now, approaching the end of this year, is not much in use any longer, because I think the reason, as I have said, is because these low-tech solutions, wearing face masks and social distancing, appear to do the job. And you don't have to really know precisely, via Bluetooth who is, because people do not care much about putting on precise information anyway. So now the focus is more on vaccines, and as Yoran has said in his presentation, so another dimension of the problems. And of course, the Omicron variant, which, we really do hope that they are not as dangerous as they appear to be. So I'm sorry about taking too much time. This is all I have to say in the presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Surai. I think this was a very interesting presentation, focusing on the specific policies and the cultural and ethical aspects related to this app, which has a lot of implications, of course. Now we have, if I understand it right, about 20 minutes left for our. So should we just start if there's any questions regarding the three presentations we have had listened to, and then I understand that we should have a little more general discussion on the implication of this workshop for the future, if I understand Torbjörn correctly.
May I perhaps interject here and remind you that the panelists can raise questions by raising your hands. But the audience are also, members of the audience are also most welcome to pose questions. And you do that by writing your questions under the chat button on the bottom of the page. But I'm happy, Göran, if you continue to moderate.
Okay. So is there any immediate questions from the panelists to any of these presentations that we have heard right now? I saw a hand, but it disappeared. Yes, it's Giuseppe, you have a question, please.
Thank you, Goran. And I would like to make a question to Luis. Hi, Luis. And do you think that the individual behaviors have achieved a new centrality in the light of their importance for the community during this pandemic?
Sorry, can you repeat if I think that?
Yes, if the individual behaviors and so the individuals have achieved a new centrality in the light of their importance for the community during the pandemic.
I'm not saying that they are aware of that, but I'm saying, I'm thinking that this is a de facto situation. And this, it's not starting now, because in the last at least two to three decades, more and more, the individuals abandoned the participation in the structures. And you see that, for example, in the abstention in elections, but also not elections, not only political elections. Think of the participation of our colleagues in the universities. Think of the relations, of the mechanisms in the different types of institutions. What is new is that not only people are participating, as they did, for example, in the Arab Spring, but they are determining the decisions. Because let's not be mistaken, not a single government decided to take protective measures in the beginning. None. The majority of governments took them later. But in fact, no government took those decisions in the beginning. They took the measures of limited confinement of the people under attack, let's say, of the disease. And then, one by one, governments understood that they could not keep with that strategy. But they try to go back every time they can. This is actually what's happening now. When, for example, Europe, in a very naive way, blocks the access to Africa, but opens all the frontiers, and some countries don't pay attention to any rules within Europe. This is completely stupid, actually, as a strategy, and everyone understands. This is the point. I was in Cape Verde last week, in Africa. Why do we have so low levels of injured people in Africa? Well, in some cases, it might relate to statistics, but certainly it's not the case of Cape Verde, or where last Wednesday, for example, because I got that figure, they had 4 more people infected, 4. But when you land in Cape Verde, you don't see one single person without a mask. One single. It's the country in Africa that has more people with vaccine. It's still a minority, but there is a discourse. You don't see beggars without a mask. You don't see anyone without a mask, because the protection of life is, but there is no dictatorship. It is not, it's something people simply do. They do it in villages. I've seen it in Africa. They do it in villages. You don't need the strong state to be present. So this is what I think is changing. What will be the outcome? I don't know. I know that in historical terms, every time the populations move in a certain direction, things change. Now, the way they will change will depend on how leadership will interact, because of course the consolidation of things always requires an institutional dimension. I often say this, let's never forget the paradox of the French Revolution. The consolidation of the French Revolution, actually republicanism, is not the fruit of Danton and Robespierre. It is the fruit of the people and the Emperor Napoleon. So it took an emperor to consolidate.
Some more questions, and we shouldn't have too much time, so perhaps we can go on.
Sure.
And I have a question from one of the listeners here to Professor Surai. How does Buddhist tradition in Thailand influence people's understanding of concept of democracy and human rights? From Jin Mao has raised that question.
Yes, it's a very important and very good question, very pertinent question for us in our context. The thing is that Buddhism has been used in the reverse way. Instead of supporting democracy and human rights, Buddhism has been used as a state apparatus by the state authorities to emphasize the opposite ideas. Because Buddhism is rather, you can look at it as going either way, depending how which part of the original teachings in the text you can pick up to support your view. So Buddhism has been, the monks, they receive money from the state, so they have become state bureaucrats, so to speak, and they have to follow the line, follow the policy of the state. So in that case, it is difficult to find the Buddhist establishment to support democracy and human rights, because as history shows, the state authorities of Thailand have been kind of reluctant to follow the path of democracy and human rights. But having said that, it doesn't mean that Buddhism in itself is in support of anti-democracy ideas. You can find, and I think these are central to the teaching of Buddhism, especially the key ideas that I mentioned earlier, interdependence and compassion. And you can find clear linkages between these ideas to democracy. And this idea has to be kind of propagated and argued for, and theories, explanations made in order for people to understand that their own religion can support these ideals.
Thank you very much. I see no more questions, so perhaps we can proceed in go to this more general discussion that also Torbjörn would like to invite us to. And I have some reflections here after our 2 days here, and then perhaps Torbjörn can take over and comment and compliment, and anyone else participating here. Because if we look back now on these 2 days, I think the conference has raised some very important ethical problems that is some examples I think we can see, and especially when we deal with a pandemic, a conflict between public health measures and human rights, civil liberties, at least a potential conflict that has been presented, not least yesterday in some of the presentations. We can see there is a conflict, perhaps, or at least a tension between individual goals and collective goals. There is also potential conflict between national interests and global international interests. And we have also, during this conference, got inputs from different worldviews. We have heard about Confucianism and Confucian perspectives. We have heard about Buddhist perspectives, as we have raised some ethical principles that we think are more universal. So perhaps what we can learn from this conference is the connection between these specific important ethical problems and how different worldviews can contribute to a solution. And the main thing, and I think that's also a conclusion from our previous conference, that there is no really conflicts between the different worldviews and religions on this matter, but we should instead lift up the common values that we have and the common notions, and here can both humanities, philosophy contribute to this understanding. So focusing on values in different traditions, which will help us to tackle these important problems that is caused both by the global climate change and the pandemic, this pandemic, and probably, unfortunately, also future pandemics. So these are some reflections from me, from my side, after listening to these presentations these 2 days. Thank you.
Thank you, Göran. We don't have so much time, and we should use the time we have economically, and I feel a little bit uncertain as to how to go about this. But from my point of view anyway, placing this webinar in a context and thinking ahead seems very important. So not to miss that opportunity, I think I will say a few words about that. And then my first point is very specific, very concrete. We should find a way to publish revised versions of these papers. The papers from last year's conference have not yet come out, and that is a disappointment, but they are in the process of being printed now, so they will be out very soon. And publishing these contributions will also be very important, I think. The papers from last year's conference will be published as an issue of Diogenes, which is the journal of CIPSH. We cannot publish these papers in another issue of Diogenes. We must find another way. And this hard to do this concretely. We should discuss with CIPSH and with the Academy of Chinese Cultures and Humanities, whose leaders, Professor Jung and Professor Osterbeck, are with us today. But maybe we don't have to get into the specifics of this now. If anyone has concrete ideas about this, please tell us. But if not, then Göran and I will discuss this matter further with Louise and Bing Dun. Then I would like to remind you what Göran also said, that last year's webinar dealt with European and Chinese resources for a global ethic. Today, this year, the topic was different, but we got back to some of the same issues. So it seems to me that cultural traditions and the quest for a moral ethic for our time is a recurring theme that should be central to our deliberations. Central to our deliberations, this means that in my view, and I hope that many of you share that, but not necessarily, in my view, these two webinars should be the beginning of a longer time endeavor. I very much hope that these webinars will be the beginning of a research program on global ethics. And I think I can speak for the Stockholm China Institute in saying that we are prepared and willing, and I think we have the competence to arrange further activities inside conferences and seminars, as well as more webinars. And we also have some competence for editing papers and for publishing. And next week, the CIPSH will have its big conference in Odense, and then hopefully we can discuss this further. But please, if anyone would like to say something about how you look at the future of this, what can we do? How should we proceed on the basis of the two webinars that we have held? I leave the floor open for comments on this and on other issues if you prefer. One thing that occurred to me yesterday when I listened to Giuseppe's presentation was that geoethics is really a notion that is universally applicable. So maybe we should bring geoethics even closer into our deliberations. geoethics plus cultural historical perspective somehow. Couldn't that form the core of future work? What do you say, Giuseppe?
Torbjörn, I think that geoethics can be a point of intersection of our activities. For example, the book that I'm editing with Luiz and is trying to bring geoethics to confront with other perspectives outside the geosciences. And in fact, we call some philosophers and to think about our proposal. But I think it is just a first step. Because what I heard during these two days, I think that it's an incredible source of ideas and possibilities to develop a common language. What I saw, I have not experience obviously on cultures about other countries, in particular to the Greek culture of China, and we have a lot of points of contact that we have to make to emerge from all, because we are saying the same thing in many ways. We call with different word, but we are thinking to the same thing. So I think that we should put together these experiences, and probably we have to find a common table. And in my opinion, geoethics try to do this. Probably there are also other proposals on the tables, but from my perspective, I see really a point of intersection of sciences and humanities, and geoethics try to do this. So I would like to continue on this, to participate, and also to promote initiatives that try to take together all this kind of community. And Goran can help a lot us. I'm not an ethicist, for example, and we need also to root geoethics well and more into philosophical perspectives, because sometimes probably we use some terms that are not used in the correct ways. But also it's a way also to go beyond labeling and also be put in practice and be more pragmatic. And I think that we need to stay together also to work well.
May I remind everyone also that the two webinars that we have held, they have been organized or held, at least held under the auspices of an Academy of Chinese Cultures and Global Humanities. So Chinese culture should be very much present, not to say central, even in our future work, unless we somehow change the basic organization. But I think the Chinese culture is one of the major cultures in the world, and it shouldn't be difficult to retain Chinese culture as part of our deliberations, our work. What we have not dealt with so far are some of the great cultural traditions of the world. For instance, the Muslim tradition of Islam. I think it would be fascinating to have presentations and studies of Muslim traditions.
Yes,
I would like to use in the plural, and
yes.
and as for a global ethic for our time.
But also from Africa, Torbjörn,
Yes,
for example,
yes.
Ubuntu culture, I think that
Yes.
could be really a great source for all of us.
So really taking world cultures into account is very, very important. Professor Hsung, do you have something to say about this? But what do you think? Do you have any ideas for the future? Will you unmute yourself, please?
Well, thank you, Tropian. I think these past 2 days have been very productive, and looking at the two webinars together, I think we find a good way. I believe, next week at the General Assembly of CIPSH, Luis and myself would bring back some of these results and to share, and I would invite you with the proposals that we include in the bulletin for discussion about, possibly have a task force or some kind of things established for the initiatives to continue to do research and have discussions about global ethics. This CIPSH Academy will continue, first of all, to try to have an in-person academy with UAI if possible. And then we would, so that would be one thing. The other is the global ethics. If the China Institute wanted to carry on and have other activities related to Chinese Cultural Bureau and the discussion of ethics, that would be very, very much welcomed. We could discuss how we might do that with the CIPSH member organizations, the Asian New Humanities Net that Professor Lee Jok-in leads now, could be one potential partner. And then, we could look to see how the General Assembly's discussion could be like about viewing other related initiatives. For instance, these two webinars all touch about health and technology. And then for years now, CIPSH would like to promote some sort of a organized initiative to focus on the discussion of health and humanities. That's one thing. And then technology and humanities. Certainly, the issues that we're focusing these 2 days about climate change and pandemic, are good sort of cases for us to promote that. I think Luis could also explain to us about what's happening in the bridges and other related efforts that we would have sort of a series of things, or promoting and work on things that are interconnected intellectually together, right, Luis?
Yes, thank you very much, Ping-Chen. I think we have today a number of interesting initiatives, some more in the intellectual side, which is the case of this seminar, some more into the operational side, which is the case of bridges. It's the project that UNESCO approved that has been largely prepared by us. And I think an important challenge is to bring these different avenues together, not to dissolve ones in the others, because each one has its own rhythm and its own purposes. We would not like to transform the academia into a sort of argumentation in favor of any sort of policies. But on the other hand, I think we need to combine things. The fact that Giuseppe is in this panel and that Torbjorn is collaborating in the book that Giuseppe had the initiative to launch, to organize on geoethics is an example of how these things can be articulated. I'm not so much in favor of putting everything into the to build a big institution. That's not what I think we should do. On the other hand, I think the way CIPSH works, which is very flexible, is a good one. And one thing we have to discuss beyond the specifics of this project supported by CCK Foundation is something that at some stage Torbjörn already last year raised as a possibility. Should we aim to build one project on ethics? Now, you know that in CIPSH we also discussed, should we have one project on health and humanities? And I more and more I think, do we need two projects? Aren't these things, in the end, if we build a project of CIPSH, something that, because we are not health experts, actually, we are, so if we build something, I don't know how it should be called, probably it would not be only about ethics, but ethics would be, for sure, its backbone. On the other hand, its focus in terms of the impact in society and the way values are now discussed in society, and I think this relates directly to ethics, is health. So we could eventually find the General Assembly, and the symposium we have next week can also help in going in this direction. I don't know, I'm only thinking, I'm not saying we should do this or that. The only thing I say no to is to build bureaucratic big institutions, because they will become conservative as any other institution. But on the other hand, we need to find some efficient framework of bringing these things together.
Thank you very much, Luis. Very good to know. So we really invite you all to think more about this and to reach out to us, to contact us about concrete and specific ideas on how to proceed. You know, my role in this, I know something about Chinese culture, but I am certainly an amateur when it comes to philosophy and ethics. I'm an amateur in the true senses of the word. I think in French, amateur emphasizes the meaning of loving something, having a taking a loving interest in something, and that is how I approach philosophy and ethics. But I'm not engaged in this field professionally. Professionally, I'm a sinologist, and therefore I'm very glad that the CIPSH has an academy on Chinese cultures. And I also think it's lovely that cultures is used in the plural in this sense. And again, I think cultural traditions, cultural history, and present situation with insights into natural sciences and not least geosciences, this combination is really crucial for good thinking about about global ethics, and about many things. Really building more bridges between the natural and the human sciences, I think, is vitally important. During the past few decades, too many scholars have been engaged in building walls between their disciplines. I think the task of CIPSH should be to cross borders, to tear down walls rather than erect them. Have I emphasized sufficiently how important Göran Kolste has been for this webinar? I very much hope that you will continue to take an interest in our work, Göran, and that we could perhaps you and I as Swedes could do some proposals that we can share with the other friends here.
Thank you for your cooperation, and certainly we are interested to continue this work.
Now, 1:45, shall we more or less wind up now? I would then like to end by thanking you all for your enthusiastic and lively participation, the panelists, of course, also the audience.